Welcome everybody to the final section of our seminar, Psychoanalytic Economies. First I'd like to thank Gabriel and Dennis for the papers they presented. And now we have a little bit of time left where we will pose some questions, and if you guys can give the answers to, and even comment on one another's texts. We have some questions here from the audience, but if there's other questions from the audiences, please let us know. I'll start off with one specific question, which I think to some extent ties in both your presentations, and we can maybe go to specific questions to each of the speakers. Dennis, you said at one point that there is a role played by sacrifice and desire. And Gabriel, you suggested that there is a political paralysis in the present because any act in the absence of a sort of positive possible future can't be justified. In other words, it feels like an empty sacrifice. But at the same time, there was a remark, I think was made by both sides, that desire wants to, much more than attain a particular object, wants to perpetuate itself. So how do you square these two positions? Is there a difference between your position, the way you framed desire and sacrifice, and the way that, Gabriel, that you framed this idea of the paralysis of the present in the absence of a possible alternative future?
Okay, I can go first on this. So when I mentioned that thing about sacrifice, I was referring explicitly to McGowan's conceptualization in his book. And his argument, as I understood it, is that the logic of the commodity parasitizes or hijacks the logic of sacrifice. So it's actually not just pure logic of sacrifice that's important, but the fact that we sacrifice and then we are able to displace our enjoyment into the possibility that a commodity somewhere in the future will redeem that sacrifice, right? So you work really hard or you renounce a lot of things, and the commodity comes in and says, okay, this is the thing you've been waiting for. This is the thing that will justify all of the sacrifices you've made. So McGowan's argument is that if everyone were to just acknowledge the enjoyment inherent in sacrifice, then it would no longer be an enjoyment postponed and directed towards the future commodity, right? It's interesting because it has the notion of future, but it's in a, not in the sense of a political project, but in the sense of something like, the next thing you want to buy, the next house, the better job. Capitalism asks you to renounce so that you can get something better than what you have, but of course once you get it, it's not enough to sustain desire. So you need to continue. So by acknowledging sacrifice in the present, acknowledging the enjoyment of sacrifice in the present, you subvert this logic.
Okay, so it's the idea that you acknowledge you sacrifice the sacrifice in the present, or something along those lines? Is that?
Yeah, something like I mean, McGowan says that there is a satisfaction that is already present that you need to hide to make capitalism work. Yeah. So what is that satisfaction, and how do you start counting that? I think that's where psychoanalysis comes in. It's all about finding satisfaction where you don't expect it to be.
But also I think that there's something else to it, which is, from what I understood of McGowan's argument, which I think is a very profound idea, is that there is something concerning the logic of renouncing. Sacrifice is not the same as renunciation, but it's the logic of renouncing something in order to make part of something. For example, you renounce freedoms to be part of a group. You renounce your free time in order to work, so to get commodities. So there's always this losing and gaining logic, which is why we call it an economy. And he's saying that this logic entails more variables, but it has some enigma, and capitalism actually works because it gives you a model for that enigma. It says, this thing you think it's hard to explain about why this positive value of renunciation is not really something present in you. It's just the anticipation of something that is in the things that you're going to get. Commodities are split between use and exchange. It's not your actual activity that is split between exchange, you're renouncing something for another, and use. You're the one who actually enjoys the exchange itself. So you're never split, it's the commodities that are split. And then we come up with the idea that there's some sort of atomized subjectivity that is actually the one that fits this duality. So commodities are dual, rational agents are univocal, right? And what he's trying to say is that if this agent is already can think, can find a better model for his own contradiction, he doesn't need to displace it to the commodity, right? Something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But one thing that I would just add to what you said is that you said, well, he's talking about economical expectations. But Marx's whole point is that those are political ones, because through those economic expectations that you reorganize the city, the polis. So that's how politics gets done. So it's funny because when people who do political activity think that they should find qualitatively distinct expectations, to trust qualitatively distinct expectations of people in order to do politics and not be only doing economy, they mistook what the economic expectation of people will actually mean. When people put expectations on how they're going to get a new house, they're actually putting a double expectation on how they're going to get their interests fulfilled and how they're going to contribute to the whole. The two things go through the commodity. Of course, the person's only directly concerned with one, but everyone knows that the other is also going on, otherwise you couldn't really do exchange. Right? So when you then say that you should have an extra set of expectations concerning the whole, you didn't understand what was going on before. So that's why the same movement that should make political considerations of the left more directed towards economical matters. It's not really a concern with petty stuff, small stuff. It's actually because the small stuff in our world is the one that actually leads to the big change.
I see.
There's some weird thing there.
Yeah. So you're saying that to count sacrifice is not just a matter of staying within the economic domain and now saying, okay, in addition to wanting this house or this product, you also want to sacrifice. But it's actually saying more like, okay, in order to get these things, there needs to be a path through politics.
It's already. And my point is that you Sergio made a remark concerning means and ends, right? Well, Dennis proposed in his presentation that the logic of commodity exchange implies that something which is a means, which is you renounce or sacrifice, is actually in itself an end. And then you said, well, but this is in fact disguised by the commodity, because you don't ever question what is the use of use. Why the hell do I want what I want? The commodity already contains that answer. You want it because this allows you to get something else, and the answer is forever postponed, but it's an answer.
Yeah.
And then you said, well, but this is not really a political future, because it's actually an economic notion of expectation, right?
Yeah.
But then my retort is that, well, for Marx, in our times, that's how political expectations work. So that's actually the political expectation. When you say, in 5 years I'm going to be able to buy my house, you're not simply talking about your private interest. You're displaying to us the whole cognitive mapping of how you understand the social space. You think that there's a continuity between your present and that future. That's your political ambition, right? So those two things are connected. The same things that are economical means, they are in another way political ends, right? So there's this inversion everywhere. I'm not sure how to follow this, but
It's interesting because I thought before when we discussed this, you had mentioned something about the bracketing of economy and politics, how like in order to see one, you have to kind of bracket the other one. But in this case, I think you're kind of proposing that
but then
they both kind of appear in the same space. Like, economic concerns are directly political and vice versa.
Yeah, but I think that the guy who proposed the bracketing, Caratani, that's why he said that these things are so close together that if you don't suspend your interest in one of them, you cannot see the logic of the other.
Okay, they're different logics, but
the same thing.
same thing. Oh, okay.
Same multiple different words.
We have another question here from the audience. This one's directed to Gabriel. We discussed at one point the architectural and the textual model. And the question is there a third possibility for this, and would the third possibility be Hegelian?
Caratani, the guy who proposed this distinction, though he's following many, like, got books from David Harvey and many other people analyzing the postmodern condition. Sometimes it's very much associated with a critique of architecture, especially where the term appeared, postmodern architecture, that's where we got the term from. So, but in Karatani's book, he already proposes his own version. He has his own idea that we should have a transcritical model, which he goes back to Kant to find, where he says that rather than looking for the truth by going from the surface, so from the accidental to the substantial, and supposing that the substantial determines the surface, the bottom determines the surface, and rather than doing the inverse, which is saying that the surface determines the bottom, the text determines the meaning, things like this, we should force ourselves to think these two things as next to each other. And the problem is why, from one perspective, it seems like if you're in this point, you look at the surface as inessential, but if you displace yourself laterally, suddenly it looks like it's the inverse. So you didn't really go down, you go side by side. He tries to think that otherness is not a matter of going to the deep or changing registers, it's a matter of moving laterally between differential systems. He has a different perspective. So there are many proposals of, I think it's a really good way of interrogating contemporary philosophy, asking what can you propose in terms of a grammar of thinking that is neither architectural nor textual, but keeps the good stuff that we learn from both methods. And the fact is that every one of these rethinks the whole tradition. So there is an architectural reading of Hegel, a textual reading of Hegel, transcritical reading. Hegel is not writing as we are here, so definitely he's not going to be the guy who's going to answer to our predicament. So, but you can read him retroactively and try to see what you can say from him from that perspective, right? So, and this has been done. Zizek does exactly this. Karatani says that this third model of critique can be found in Kant, the way Kant thinks transcendental reduction, because Kant supposes that we only get the impression that there are two levels by bracketing something out of the surface. When you take something out of the surface, you constitute autonomous domains. So, for example, if you stop thinking, if you forget the problem of how communities get together and in a non-statal form, clan society, if you bracket that problem, you can think about the origin of the logic of the state, as if people got together, made a pact, and came up to the state. But you need to bracket the reality a bit, so that the logic appears in its purity. If you were to consider the messy history, it's not that you would get a richer theory, you simply wouldn't develop the theory. And the opposite as well. If you want to understand capital, you need to bracket state laws, taxation, things like this, property relations, because they're not constitutive of that logic. Of course, commodities depend on it, but if you don't bracket, you don't get the pure logic of capital. So, is that bracketing essential? No. You can remove it and then fall back into the richness of the object. But you need to be able to move sideways between logics. Say, okay, I need to suspend my interest in this question so that the other question constitutes itself. And he says that, well, we find this in Kant, because Kant will say, to get the field of science, where you can ask meaningful statements about the true or the false, you need to purposefully suspend the questions of is it beautiful or is it right? If you are thinking about those things, you're not going to be able to think scientifically. But that's not to say that the object cannot be investigated in all those properties at the same time. You're just not going to get an answer. So you need to suspend something to think the suspension creates the object of a theory, but you can unbracket it. So there's not any fundamental model. And I think that's a very general, interesting thesis and tendency today to use formalisms that are not fundamental formalisms. They're not foundations, they're models. There are many models. But use a good example of this.
But this, I would just ask this question that, would you say that the operation of bracketing, is that a philosophical operation?
Good question.
In the sense of...
which field is doing this sort of work?
Which field, because also you mentioned the thing about free association and this condition, creating this space where...
It's a bracketing.
Yeah, it seems to be a bracketing, right? You're saying the rules of outside discourse end as soon as you walk into the...
I think it's a logistical operation.
Logistical.
Yeah, logistics is that which creates a bracketed space.
Yeah.
By scientific experiments, they require preliminary work to create a space where certain conditions don't matter. Within that artificial space, a logic of the object can emerge. I would say that that's a place that is between concrete abstraction, it's not theoretical abstraction. I'm not going to look at this object and only think about its form. It's not a matter of thinking. It's a matter of creating an environment, concrete environment, where this object will only interact with others due to its form. Right? It's like creating the vacuum in a place. It's not a matter of thinking, when thinking, let's say, happening in a metaphorical vacuum.
Right.
It's a matter of actually creating a vacuum. To actually create a vacuum, to see what happens in the space, you need energy, you have costs, you need work. It's the sort of work that goes into abstracting something from the world. That's kind of a concrete way of understanding bracketing.
Yeah.
Connects all these themes of kind of infrastructure.
Yeah. So in that sense, bracketing, it fits into the Badiou framework of objective appearance. It's not, bracketing is not an operation that is subjective. Like,
no, it's not a theoretical thing.
Yeah, you need to think differently.
That's very good. Yeah.
You actually need to add something to the whole.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, I wouldn't say that bracketing. In science, I would definitely associate it with, in Badiou's sense, with forcing, because it's literally forcing a condition. It's not enough for implication. It's not like if this is the case, then that's the case for every case.
Yeah.
He says that if you accept that I just separated this from the world, then this and this follow. So there is a local condition of investigation. It concerns what Badiou calls inquiries and things like this, like creating environments where you create a tension, a decision point, right? A place where something gets decided. So there is something like this border is very much connected with the experimental dimension of things, the logistical infrastructure for kind of space, autonomous space to be created. I wouldn't know how to pinpoint it, but I think that's one of the most interesting researches today. How does Alain Badiou's work connect with that dimension?
Another question here. This one is for Dennis. The remark is that you seem to move between Hayek, Lacan, and Marx. Hayek with objective belief, Lacan with the notion of the other, and then with Marx with commodity fetishism. And suggests here that one of the definitions of a fetish is when the properties of a position are confused with the properties of the subject that occupies the position. In other words, there is a need to suppose a single mind for Hayek in the economy.
Yeah.
And then in virtue of this need to suppose this, you posit a certain necessary knowledge into it. And the question concretely, I guess, works down to this idea of, given that for Lacan the other and the subject supposed to know are not reducible to one another, does the concept of subject supposed to know, does that clarify the situation when you try to read, read Hayek's remarks through a psychoanalytic and Marxist lens?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty complicated question, but I think a good starting point is if we wanted to distinguish between other and subject supposed to know today, I think as far as the market is concerned, I would say that the economists and those who hold the gatekeepers to economic theory, they're the ones that are the subject supposed to know. But the other is different in the sense that the other is more of this structural thing, not necessarily embodied in any group of people or whatever. It's just this. It's a reference point that you could maybe one way to say it is that the subject's supposed to know the economists. They clarify or they they formalize, they clarify the other for us, what the other wants from us, right? So our first experience is, okay, we're in the market, we don't understand why things are not working out for us personally, we're not getting the job we want, or we're not advancing through society, and then we turn on the TV and the economist says, okay, it's because the state is putting too much regulation in place. And where politicians can play the same role, they can say, we're paying too much money to these welfare programs. That money could have been put into businesses, which would have then hired you, and you would have been able, or of course, too many immigrants are coming in. And so the subject's supposed to know is somehow regulating or filtering the otherness of the other for us to make it comprehensible.
So the suggestion is that it would be the experts, economic experts, that are the subject supposed to know, while the sort of rules of the economy are the other, and not the other way around.
Yeah, that's how I see it. And if you were to try to extend this further in psychoanalysis, you could say, like, what is the figure of the analyst in this case? The analyst would be someone who doesn't fulfill that expectation of making sense of the other for you, right? And I think it has to do with this logic of suspending the rules so that the thing you expect from the other is made visible, rather than, because the thing of always wondering what the market wants from you, that always hides a more fundamental thing of what do you want. I think that there's something like that there where it's easier, in some sense it's easier to accept what the market tells you to want, right? So an analytic procedure would be something, I mean, it's kind of, I don't know if I'm violating this thing of like applying Lacan already without,
golden rule.
yeah, without creating that boundary, but yeah, I would venture to say it would be productive to suspend the question of what the market wants from you, so that you can ask the question of what is it that you want from the market, which then leads to the question of politics.
So then, just to be clear, so the idea is that something like the position or the function of an analyst in this situation wouldn't interrogate, let's say the subject's supposed to know whatever that is in the market or the other, but it would interrogate the relationship that subjects take to, right, these functions, right? It's a relation of what is it that we rely on the other for and the subject's supposed to know, as opposed to interrogating that function directly, right? Sort of interrogating it through the mediation of the subject itself or something.
Yeah, I think it's a reversal of the whole ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Today what we need is something like ask not what you can do for the market, but ask what the market can do for you.
Or what it's already doing for you.
Yeah, or what it maybe is already doing to you.
Did you have a comment on this as well?
Oh yeah, well, two things I actually wanted to hear Dennis talk about this a bit, because there's just one remark before that is that I always thought that it was a very kind of conservative or weak position that Lombardi takes with regards to politics when he says, well, politics happens at a distance of the state. But he also says, well, this is because it measures the power of the state. But being able to measure the power of the state means being able to extract an exact idea about what the logic of this general field of possibilities actually is like. So the logic that you are developing there seems to make a lot of sense, that if you first suspend some mediation that connects your private interest to the global complexity, so you don't take the subject supposed to know as some sort of guarantee that your enigmas are actually explainable in that sense. The other option you have is to construct a local apparatus, for example, an organization where your problems in life will still be there, but you're going to try to associate people in a different way in order to solve them. And then you will see which are the actual rules that you're following, even if you don't know, but are your rules, right? And which one were extrinsic ones. So that's a distance from the state, like an experiment, political experiment is something like this.
Yeah.
But then what I wanted to ask you is the following. Like with fetishism for Marx, it doesn't create any enigma for people. People don't ask what's going on. It's very clear. For Lacan, the other is something very enigmatic. You want to know what the hell is going on. And it seems like it's hard to connect the two because precisely Marx's fetishism has no enigma. Lacan's other is filled with enigmas.
Yeah.
But then you're saying that, I want to know, what would you say is the state of Hayek's single mind in this question? Because it's true, it poses some sort of questions, but it poses answerable questions.
Yeah.
When you ask yourself, what the hell is going on with the market? And an specialist tells you, the market woke up today kind of out of, in a bad humor. That statement somehow is an answer. How is that an answer?
Yeah.
If somebody told us in the community a long time ago, God woke up in a bad humor today, that wouldn't satisfy. Like, so what the hell did I did wrong?
Yeah.
Right? So somehow there is a very specific status between enigma and non-enigma. for the Hayekian position,
Yeah.
because you can agree that there are questions, something is disturbing, but it's the disturbance that you can appease. You can,
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe that is the function of ideology. It is to make a continuous line between what the market thinks and what I think. Like as we were talking earlier, like because why is the other enigmatic in psychoanalysis? Because the other thinks constitutively differently from how I think, but yet like determines me or determines some aspect of my life. So it's enigmatic because you want to find, maybe if you're already in analysis, then you want to find what that other thinking is, the other logic. But in the case of maybe the Hayekian universe, there's no mystery, because the other is just, the other is thinking what you're thinking, in a sense. It's just on a larger scale.
it's an interesting idea. So let's say ideology in this case is not the idea that you don't have questions about your world, is that they have answers.
Yeah, they have answers, and it's rational, and you have all this mathematics that makes it seem like it's in line with the scientific viewpoint of. There's a lot of ways to justify it.
Perhaps one or two more questions?
Sure.
Is that all right? Let's see.
Richard, didn't you say?
Yeah, I have some questions. I can ask them.
Absolutely.
So, one of the things I was interested in, maybe between your papers, was again going back to this question of the market having a single mind and Hayek. And this thing of appearing as if it has a single mind, kind of determining the presence of a single mind sitting up behind it, but noting this weird resonance maybe with Gabriel's presentation at one point when you were talking about the analytic process, beginning with a statement, having these silences, followed up with another statement, deducing or identifying or intuiting the presence of a subject there because of how the statements go together. So I was wondering about between these two, with the deduction of a single mind, the market, or the deduction of a subject coming out of these statements with silences in between, how that process of deduction is different or comparable.
Do you want to go first?
I could, yes. Honestly, I think that touches on what perhaps is, for Lacanians, for other psychoanalysts, that's not so important. For Lacanians, a very, very important question, because one of the main contentions of analytic theory is that it has some scientific status because it reveals something of subjectivity, which it leaves unharmed. So it answers to, for example, the Foucaultian critique of psychoanalysis as an apparatus, because it does not produce anything. Since the analyst is always removing oneself, whatever happens is of the responsibility of the subject, and it's of singularity of that individual there. We don't try to generalize it for everyone. It tends towards singularity, therefore, if it tends towards singularity, then it's not imposed. Because if you were to impose, we would have to impose a rule, therefore it's not a rule, therefore you didn't impose. But that's not true. You can think of very complex systems or formalisms in which you can produce something singular. That's what Badiou shows. So psychoanalysis has a very restricted epistemological reason to say that it doesn't produce the subject that it treats.
Mm-hmm.
Normally that would be a bad thing. Aha, so you are imposing something on people. But what if we found out a way to impose something that's better than what there is,
Mm-hmm.
What if forcing something actually is a way of producing novelty, and people who don't want that simply don't go to analysis or go to one session and never come back. So what if the existence of the unconscious is something that is historically being inscribed into the world, rather than something that we are discovering that was always already there, hidden in the world. So usually that distinction would be a distinction between psychoanalysis as a sort of apparatus for reproducing social relations already in the world versus revealing emancipation. and revelation and emancipation going together is fundamentally a Christian idea. So we forever tie psychoanalysis with Christianity. So this way you can actually uncouple these two things and say, no, you can divide the idea of production of subjectivity into a productive or a emancipatory, potentially emancipatory verb, where something indeterminate is being produced, not discovered. And another one where, no, if you're producing, then you're producing in a determinate fashion, therefore you're producing a determinate result. So I think that question is essential question. And in my opinion, what Marxism still has to think is exactly of the same order, because we usually have a theory of politics that, it's funny, I really wanted to know what you think of this. My impression that the 20th century divided the problem of politics into two opposite poles, responsibility or complexity. You can accept that you can produce processes you cannot control. That's a liberal perspective. And if you cannot control them, then there's freedom. Or you can try to responsibly guarantee justice, which means to be responsible for the social project you're proposing, but you need to control it. So either you have control and responsibility, or you have lack of control, but non-responsibility. So for example, who counts the number of dead people produced by the actual economic machine? It's impossible, because you cannot tell the causal connection. Who is responsible? No one's responsible. So it's impossible to count the dead. Only possible to count the dead for those projects where political people consider themselves responsible for controlling it. In processes where you don't suppose you control, you cannot count the dead. So there's a disjunction. What we never got was, how can you responsibilize yourself for effects that you cannot control? And suddenly, if you bring these two things together, complexity and responsibility, you reconstruct the analytic problem.
Yeah.
It's basically that, like, I speak things, I don't control them, but I spoke them. So how are you going to answer for that? Right?
That's a good point.
So I think that question and the question with Hayek and complexity and responsibility, it touches on many points.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer to that. Yeah, the only thing I would add is maybe to go back to connecting your question with Sergeant's earlier one about subjects supposed to know, this idea of if there's a single mind, what is it that this mind is thinking? It's not simply thinking like prices as like, because, well, what does it mean, first of all, to think a price? I think implicit in there is some kind of model of causality in the market. Like, sometimes these effects can be kind of clear, right? If there's a natural disaster and the price of gasoline goes up, right? We can look at the market, we see these two things happening, and we say, okay, there's a connection here, and it makes sense that there's some disaster here, and because the resources that are required to move oil around are centered in this place of the disaster, therefore the price of this commodity fluctuates, right? So things respond in this, like, you know, in the physical sense of cause and effect. But then I think, so that's one way of thinking what the single mind thinks. The single mind is someone or something that not only gives us answers, or not only can be interpreted to give us answers to what we want and so on, but it also itself thinks the entire world of interactions between different phenomena. And but then there's gaps, right? There's moments when there's not, because the problem is, as soon as you can predict, as soon as you can think as fast as the market can, you can make money, because you can go onto the market and you can buy things and sell them later. You know, basically you can play the market, right? But there are definitely, I mean, if you extend that logic further, of course you'll see that if the market is counting on the fact that you're trying to catch up with it, then it's always going to be, as you were saying, like a complex process, right? If a small group of people understood the market, like we were talking about that movie Pi, the first Aronofsky movie, the whole plot is that guy finds the formula for figuring out how prices fluctuate ahead of the market. Well, the problem with that is as soon as you start to act on that knowledge, the market will factor that in, and you will produce another result that you can't follow. So I think that's somewhere in there you can find an idea of this thinking single mind as being always one step ahead of our attempts to control.
But don't you think that, sorry to interrupt, but don't you think that single mind, because I understand why you think sometimes it's a bit quick to say that Hayek's saying that it's like a single mind, because it's not giving any properties to the market that you would give to somebody who singly control everything. So it seems to keep 1 degree away from simply being the market is a single mind. It is as if.
As if.
So what does this as if mean? It means that whatever goes on there is commensurable with the single mind.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that it's, so there's, to be commensurable means that were you to try something, you could then have a partner that you can play, because you can play with another mind,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I wonder if we shouldn't,
I see what you
see, like, one thing is to say that guarantees the commensurability between thinkers and the processes,
yeah.
right? The other thing, because it could be something that's like alien, like it's just an alien force, something that doesn't, not going to be able to, you can respond to parts of the market, but you cannot respond to the market. So I've never seen a statement that says, you know, today a fragment of the market woke up in a bad humor.
Mm-hmm.
That would not be that would be to say that the market is not commensurate with a single mind. You can't even metaphorize it as a single mind.
Yeah.
So that would be a statement about minds, not about the market, right?
Yeah.
So when you say it's like a single mind, you're making a statement about everyone's minds, not about the market. You're saying your mind is commensurable with what's going on.
So every single mind is commensurable with all other minds.
It ends up being that, but it's commensurable with the global effect. You cannot control it, but you can think it. It's like a know and think distinction.
Yeah, I think that's
It's a
basically what I'm
content.
saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's almost like, you know.
It's a guarantee that you can think what you cannot know.
Yeah, it is a weird version of the actual, everything that's actual is rational, I think.
So, that's a question.
In a weird way, because everything that can be counted in the market is rational and rationalized.
But to be rational, you say that it's thinkable.
Thinkable.
Okay. Something to think about.
We have time maybe for one more question. Well, I'll ask one that just kind of came up as we were talking. And maybe both of you can comment on this, though it refers specifically to Gabriel's recent comment and something that came up in the presentation. Namely, so you talked about this idea of saying, well, you brought up this example, right, that instead of considering the people, so to speak, a populace, you considered a vulgus. You made some distinction between you can popularize something of, let's say, high theory, which means you frame it or you articulate it in language which is more accessible, but without necessarily losing it. You may be losing some of the detail, but not losing anything of the logic involved, right? You distinguish that from vulgarizing something, right? And you mentioned that when some idea then passes through, it's not being sort of passed on and remaining the same, but there's something lost with each particular transmission. And you suggested that the task, political task, if I could say, organizational task, would be to take into consideration that reality, so to speak, and then try to construct a space such that this phenomena will be able to, I think it was subtract the people out, subtract some kind of consistency back at it. And I wonder do you guys both think that there's a way to take this idea of saying that thinking a political junction between responsibility and lack of control as a way to consider that situation? Because there does seem to be a responsibility if you put forth some kind of message that's going to get vulgarized, let's say. But it's completely beyond your control, so to speak, right? Because you can't depend on a certain consistency. I wonder if there's maybe something to think about, like both the question of taking this sort of junction in consideration, this idea of vulgus, and maybe also whether some formulation of this junction could be the thing to use to sort of frame a particular space such that something productive can be subtracted out.
Yeah, I
If you
think
guys have any
no, I
thoughts on
understand.
that,
But
maybe we
I mean, then it's not a matter of not something you can extract from what I said, but it's my opinion on the matter based on political experience. My conviction is that the interesting projects in politics will probably come not from the debate between centralization and decentralization, but from the possibility of locally creating centralized but uncontrollable phenomena. So creating organizations which are not the global, they're not the totality of organizations. So I think that this is the inversion that we should look for. Like, central planning should serve to create, to give logistical conditions for decentralized, localized projects, where we tend to think the inverse. If something is local, like a university, it should be central, and the government should, and the market should be decentralized. My impression that perhaps we should have the inverse. A central thing whose main concern is guaranteeing the autonomy of the localized things. Then locally you can create projects that you cannot control. Rather than you should have local markets and global states rather than global markets and local states.
Oh, yeah.
Like the circle works like that. You create a border so that you have some sort of limit to the organization. When the people are in, you say, I don't know what you're going to do with this. And try to create projects that you lose control over them. But since you're losing control over something which has a border, the effects can be referred back. The letter has a destination. You can say, this didn't work, but it's our fault. We're the ones who created a space and tried something that makes no sense. Right? Whereas
Just to clarify, when you say circle, you're referring to the
circle
studies,
yes,
the
I'm a
ideology.
political organization, yes. So, but it doesn't matter to any organization. When you try something out in a political organization, a party or something like this, if something fails inside that organization, the circuit that connects that failure, that comes from losing control, back to the responsible militants, you can guarantee that connect. The logistical basis is guaranteed. Where if that basis is not there, you cannot relate back processes that go totally crazy with any sort of accountability for them, or even not accountability in the simple sense of redemption of true ethical guilt, but you cannot experiment. Experiments require that the result of what you do is referred back to the initial conditions as a critique of your wrong assumptions. We cannot fail politically. We cannot even fail politically today because there is nothing guaranteeing that when we fail, these things that came out of our control will be then referred back to our assumptions. It seems like something came from the outside and prevented us from achieving our goals. So I think it goes very much in the direction of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think just to problematize or whatever that is, do you think that I thought it was a bit ambiguous, this idea of logistics, because how do you differentiate it from being just an ethics or something?
Logistics?
Yeah. I mean, in the sense that you just said of bringing responsibility back.
No, it's,
for
but you know,
effects.
but that's the thing. Like, that's a distinction between ethics and politics, I think. If you're doing politics and things go wrong, you don't need ethics to see the effects. You don't need to create a schema in your mind in which that thing represents your interests and therefore you should answer for it. You will answer for it. People will come to your door.
Ah, okay.
Right? There's no ethics. That's actually a good example.
Yeah.
A good science is like this. They don't care about ethics. You do an experiment, it works, it doesn't work, you see the cause and effect. You don't need to reconstruct it because God doesn't want you to go that way. It's usually when there is no logistical basis to register the effect into a causal explanation, because logistics is more on cause and effect than the side of the interpretation, right? Is precisely what goes from physical systems to symbolic systems, it's in between the two. So it's precisely because logistics exists that you don't need ethics. You don't need to like your neighbor. Mail arrives to both of you in the same way, and if the mail doesn't arrive, you go to the mailman and get the whole logistical, ethical question of how am I going to mediate my contact with the neighbor is suspended because logistics is the mediation. So you don't need to pose that question.
Right.
So that's what I find interesting. When we fail politically, we need an ethics to reconstruct the effects because there is no material relation there. Like, we didn't try that hard to do something to see if the effects of why it failed connect with some of the things we did. So I think that's how I think it's a really good idea because of this. Like people say that it's a substitution, right, of ethics as a criteria for more immanently political criteria, right? Materially based on the administration of life and things like this. So it's an important point, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank Dennis and Gabriel for joining us here for yesterday and today. And hopefully we can do this again.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.